Hello and welcome again to SDHistCon Winter Quarters 2026. I'm Andrew Bucholtz from the SDHist board, and I'm joined by designer Brian Train. And thank you so much for joining us, Brian. And do you want to just give a little bit of an intro about yourself and why you're here?
Sure thing, Andrew. Thanks. And thanks for inviting me. We last spoke a couple of years ago at the SDHistCon Online. It was great. And thanks for calling me back and having me account for my last year or so. I'm Brian Train. I think probably some of the people in the audience know of me already. I'm from Canada. I'm in Victoria, BC, Canada. I've been playing war games since 1979, 1980, and I've been designing them since 1991. So I have about 35 years of working on war games intermittently. And I have about 70 designs that I would call published or generally available to people in some form or another. Probably I'm mostly known for the three GMT coin system titles. Those seem to be the most popular, but we're also going to be talking about a couple volumes of smaller, similar games in the Brief Border Wars system that I published with Compass Games. And in the past, before getting involved with GMT, I published a few magazine games in Decision historical simulations in their modern war, world at war, and strategy and tactics. I also design a lot of things that are a little unusual and certainly unsaleable. So I release them through my own imprint, which I call BTR Games. And a lot of them are available for free print and play off my website. And Andrew supplied you with a link to my blog where you can go to the page where that is. A few of them are also available on Wargame Vault for not very much. And one of those is a GMT coin system game called O Canada that we'll be talking about later that has an interesting history.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with so yes, the blog post you mentioned is one, and I'll link it in the comments here in a second. But you went through your 2025 and you released 7 games in one form or another, which is really just incredible. You had a reprint of Winter Thunder, you made the 91 DSSB Staff Game public, and then you published Brief Border Wars, Volume 2, China's War, O Canada, Gravel, and the new version of Quick. So how do you feel about 2025 overall from a perspective of what you put out there?
It was a busy year. It was certainly a busy year. It was busy on the design front, and of course, it was busy on the personal front. And of course, it's busy on the political front because I've been spending a certain amount of time thinking about some issues, between our two countries. Unfortunately, I've made the decision not to go back to the United States for some time. So it was usually my habit to go to Consum World Expo, in Arizona and that sort of thing. I just, it's difficult right now. And it won't always be difficult, but for the time being, that was something that also, occupied a bit of my attention and my effort in writing and research. Some of the things that came out this year are things that I've been waiting for them to come out for some time. One of those is China's War, for example. We'll be talking more about China's War later, but China's War is something that I came up with, and I got it to about the 2/3 done phase in 2015, like 10 years ago. But I shelved it and work on it because I wanted to do some time to finish off Colonial Twilight properly, which I think was time well spent. It's a game that's been very well received. But I put it on the shelf for a little while. I was just getting back to it, 2018, 2019, and we're ready to get into some more testing and development with GMT because they had picked it up readily on the P500 list. Then COVID happened. And COVID derailed everything for quite a while. And in the middle of that, my father died. So that occupied, a lot of my time in 2021. And so by the time we got back to it, things went well. I mean, overall, there were very few problems, in developing the game and getting it to come out, because the development team of Jason and Joe were just great, wonderful people to work with. They kept. From time to time, though, they'd have to go and do some work on Red Dust Rebellion, which was being developed at the same time. And that's fair enough. That's a game that's had phenomenal sales and has attracted a lot of people, a lot of people's attention, and drawn a lot of people into the coin system too. I think it was time, certainly, that it had some kind of a science fiction setting, and it's done well. Anyway, after 10 years, which is pretty much the longest gestation period of any of my games, it finally came out through GMT. And I'm just really happy to see it, thudding into people's mailboxes and onto their tables. Um, by and large, the reception's been really, really good. Brief Border Wars Volume 2 was another one that I, had to wait a little bit on that. As soon as Brief Border Wars 1 came out, Compass Games asked me for Volume 2, and we started work on that right away. But there was about a two and a half year wait in between us finally signing off on all of the art and the development, that kind of thing, because again, that went really smoothly. But then there was just like this 2-year hiatus where nothing happened. I would have been, it would have been nice if I hadn't had to do that, but hey, it's the publisher. It's the publisher's game, and they can play it how they like. O Canada is another game that took a little while to reach the light of day. It was a game I designed during lockdown, and I got it, in 2021, and I got it to the, pretty much done point very quickly. I play tested it at a couple of conventions with local people, local designers, and I just figured, last year, pull the pin on it and let's let it out into the wild. And the Winter Thunder that you mentioned, that is a straight out reprint of a game that I had done with Tiny Battles. It's in Japanese language, but the graphics are, I don't know if you've ever seen copies of Japanese Command Magazine or Bonsai Games. That's the sort of folio game publisher. The Japanese printing industry is just stupendous. The quality that they produce is very, very high. It's expensive, but it's really beautiful to look at. I think I'm going to have another piece, another game of mine coming out next year, or this year rather. I think in Command Japan, and it's going to look very nice too. Yeah, it's going to be a redo of my game Balkan Gamble. Which is the Allied invasions of Greece and Yugoslavia in World War II that never happened. It was done in two forms. It was published in Strategy and Tactics magazine using the Victory in Normandy system about 10 years ago. But the original system that I had for the game was something that I've used. Actually, it's the same system as is used in Winter Thunder. It's diceless. And it's largely diceless, and it works on Command HQ activation. So, if people like that system, then, they can take it to the Balkans instead of the Bulge. I have a third game that I designed called Summer Lightning that also uses that system as well. That's about the Poland 1939 campaign that came out through Lock and Load.
Very cool. Well, before we get to the next part, we got a great question here from Harold Buchanan.
Hello, Harold.
Asking if you count how many games you've designed, and if you're approaching Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours or 1,000 hours for expertise.
Yeah, it's funny, that my favorite uncle gave me a copy of Tactics 2. For Christmas one year when I was 15, and that was my first war game. And I don't think my parents ever forgave him for that. But my favorite uncle, he was an illustrator. He was a painter and an illustrator, and a wonderful man. And he used to say to me, "The only difference between you and me is 10,000 drawings." So I think that's kind of what Gladwell was getting at there.
Yeah.
Well, as I said, I've got about 70 games, that I would consider sort of completed, published, and made available to people,
Hmm.
through one form or another. I'm always working on some more. We'll be talking about those at the end of my current projects, at the end, if we've got time. So there's always some stuff on the cook. There's a couple of things that I've been on, and they just never seem to get around to finishing them off, or more likely
Hmm.
finding people to test it out and develop them with me. Because again, I'm in Victoria here.
Hmm.
There is a gaming community out here. A lot of people play board games. Of course, we have board game cafes and things. And there's a couple of war game people and war game designers, but nobody is really quite on the wavelength. Like people, if you're going to engage a tester or a developer, then you really have to get somebody who's actually interested in the topic, because nobody gets
Hmm.
paid to help you design or develop anything except through maybe a copy, of the game. Well, definitely a copy of the game. That's only fair. Um, I mean, it can be difficult to kind of get something finished off, and there's different
Hmm.
topics, different issues that I like to work on from time to time. I'm interested in asymmetry in games generally,
Hmm.
and that's asymmetry of information. So that's like intelligence games and hidden information, that kind of thing,
Hmm.
deception warfare, that sort of thing, as well as asymmetry of methods, asymmetry of forces, asymmetry of how people fight, doctrine, that kind of thing. And so it can be difficult sometimes to engage people with that. Now, thankfully, we have Tabletop Simulator now. That's so that there's that
Hmm.
method, and I have made a number of my games available as Tabletop Simulator modules. And of course, GMT is now using Tabletop Simulator for playtesting its games, which I think is good. Vassal was great, but with Vassal, there's a user interface you really have to struggle with. And
Hmm.
with Tabletop Simulator, which is more like a digital port of an analog game, even with things that you can knock over on the table, I think it's more intuitive to a lot of people, and then they can just grapple with designing the game itself and not trying to figure out which key combination they need to get something done. The problem is I'm not a very good programmer,
Mm.
so it's difficult for me to set up Tabletop Simulator modules unless they're extremely simple. Like some of my
Mhm.
abstract games, really, it's just like an 8x8 grid and a deck of ordinary playing cards or something like that. That's the sort of thing that you can throw together very quickly. On Tabletop Simulator, but other things like war games and stuff like that, where you have to set up each counter individually, I find that much more of a challenge because it's such a freaking bore. Anyway, but that's how that goes. So there are a few other games. There's probably I guess maybe 4 or 5 other games that are kind of sitting on my shelf right now that I'm not
Mhm.
actively working on. Mostly they deal with urban warfare and intelligence. Urban warfare, again, as you know, is a particular interest of mine,
Mhm.
and
Absolutely.
I intend to be doing a lot more on urban warfare, especially urban irregular warfare, as time and opportunity allows.
For sure. You mentioned a lot of those different things here, Brian, but why don't we start with Brief Border Wars Volume 2? That one's interesting to me because it's a bunch of really undergamed conflicts. And yeah, there you go. Absolutely. Great to see that. And I'll put a link to it shortly. But I was curious, what led to you wanting to make a Volume 2 in the first place?
Because it was fun. The first game in the Brief Border War system is called the Little War, and that came out in 2017. And it was about the 1 week war between Hungary and Slovakia in 1939, where Hungary attacked Slovakia just as the Czechoslovakia was being torn apart by the Nazis. And they took the opportunity to nab a little bit of eastern Slovakia, and they fought for about a week before the Germans shut everything down and said, "Now play nice, boys." Um, that was an interesting and flexible system, and I wanted to do more along those lines. And so I really like the quad idea, the old SPI Quadra games, where you have a set of core rules and then some exclusive rules that that fit the particular situation, and you've got like a set of flexible core rules. I really like that idea. When SPI was active, a lot of people liked that idea. They published 16 Quadra games, and I have an article written. It's available on my website about 40 or 50 other ideas for quad games that they never published, but it was a very popular way for them to do it. And so I've done the quad thing, well, 3 times now, because it's Brief Border Wars Volume 1 is 4 games in 1 box. Now we have Brief Border Wars 2, which is 4 more. And the District Commander system is sort of a quad approach. I published that with Hollandspiel. That's an operational level, campaign level counterinsurgency game that's diceless. It has a set of core rules with exclusive rules, but instead of putting 4 volumes in 1 box, we published it separately. But it's the same idea, where you have core rules plus an exclusive rule set. So they could have been put all in a box, but it would be a fat box. It was fun working on the first batch of Brief Border Wars Volume 1, because again, this was an unusual and eclectic set of games, or rather conflicts. Nobody had ever done a game before on the Football War, which is 1969 Honduras and El Salvador. Nobody had ever done one on the invasion of Cyprus, and nobody had ever done one really on the Second Lebanon War either, not in the sense of a large standing game. And I think an obscure Hong Kong company a long time ago did a third Indochina War game, but that was it. So these are things that people had not done, or had very rarely done, or done in the past. And I really like that as well. And the system seemed really adaptable. And as soon as Brief Border Wars, hit and it proved popular, Compass Games asked me for Volume 2. And they thought that a pre-1945 set would be good, because in Brief Border Wars Volume 1, everything is modern. It's from 1969 to 2006.
Absolutely.
And Brief Border Wars, everything is 1940 or earlier. The Second Balkan War is 1913, Teschen is 1919, and Nomonhan is 1939, and the Italo-Greek War is 1940. Now, again, with these games, there have been quite a few games actually on Nomonhan or Halkingol. It's that clash between the Japanese and the Soviets out in Mongolia. There have also been several games on the Italo-Greek War of 1940. Second Balkan War, I don't think it's ever had a game specifically devoted to it. Joe Miranda did a game on the Balkan Wars, both of them. So it's kind of a scenario in that sort of thing. But nobody had ever done a Teschen thing. Matter of fact, Teschen was kind of like the original inspiration for the Brief Border War system, because one day we were goofing around on Consum World talking about tiny, short little wars, and someone said, Teschen, what about Teschen? And everybody had to look it up and see what the heck they meant by Teschen. And right. I looked at it and I thought, okay, right, that's an interesting situation, but maybe there's not a game in it. And then later I found out about this Hungarian-Slovak War. And then, after that it worked out, I went back and I had another look at Teschen, and I unearthed a little bit more research, on the order of battle and stuff like that, that said, okay, yeah, maybe there's a game in here after all. So in the end, I did come out with a Teschen thing, but it kind of started out almost as a joke. And there's been a few war games that have emerged, that were kind of based on dares. I think Outdoor Survival, is a game by James Dunnigan, and Tom Shaw and James Dunnigan were bullshitting one day, and why don't you go play a game about getting lost, Jim? So he did. And Battle for Germany is that Jim Dunnigan came up with. Like 24 hours. That's how the legend goes, and that may have been a dare as well. So that's good too.
A very influential one with that setting up Downfall recently. So
yeah. There's some brilliant concepts in there too, and it just goes to show you just how quickly things can go when you've got an idea, when you've got a system, and you can marry them. As a matter of fact, I mentioned the Little War that was published by Hollandspiel back in 2017. That was actually 2 games in 1 box. The other game was called Ukrainian Crisis, which was a game that I
Mm-hmm.
put together about the Ukrainian crisis in 2014. I put it together over the very weekend of the sham referendum that the Russians held, in Crimea, and in March 2014. And it looked like there was going to be a large and overt Russian intervention. As it turned out, things turned out differently. But I thought, okay, I've got a weekend. Let's put together a game on the
Yeah.
political, military, information sphere activities, surrounding Ukraine, and let's put it together, And by Monday, which was the day of the referendum, I had the thing up on my website. And it attracted some attention, but it was almost all by people who were expecting a computer game. And, they click in, they find out, it's paper game. I have to print it. I have to stick things to things and roll dice. No. However, it did come out a few years later, through Hollandspiel in a box. But it just goes to show you sometimes just how you can throw a game together very quickly to explore a particular topic. And I like to do this with contemporary topics. I have this whole shtick going about what I call game-based journalism.
Mm-hmm.
I like to design games on conflicts that are contemporary, could be happening very soon or are happening. And of course, I'm often not right with these sorts of things, but it's a way of exploring these kinds of problems and the different directions they should go. And of course, analog board games are the way to produce these news games. So I've lectured on this elsewhere on my website. There's lists of presentations and texts that I've written or made available on this kind of thing, and some other things as well. It's something that I find is really interesting. It's something that Jim Dunnigan was interested in way back when, with games like Year of the Rat. In 1972 about the Easter Offensive. That was in S&T within 6 months of the offensive. And in 1972, that's still within one news cycle. But it's been possible for me to create games, within just a couple of days or a couple of weeks that at least sketch in some of the outlines of a problem and give something people to play with.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's fascinating. And I know we talked about that a lot in our last interview. So I'll drop a link to that in the chat for people interested in some of the stuff you mentioned from your website as well. A thing and before we move on to China's war, though, I mean, you mentioned Jim Dunnigan and also sort of joke games. And as you wrote that's sort of the inspiration for your O Canada, the Canadian Civil War that Dunnigan and SPI sort of maybe were joking about back in the 70s.
Yeah, it was treated lightly at the time, but then it got a little bit more serious. O Canada, we'll be talking about more O Canada in a little bit more detail later, but essentially O Canada it's a 4-player asymmetric game, and it is a reboot of Canadian Civil War, which is a game that Jim Dunnigan put together in 1976. And at the time, Jim Dunnigan was putting together all of these power politics games, like Russian Civil War, Minuteman, and after the Holocaust. There was Redmond Simonson as well. I find these are some of the most interesting games that SPI put out because it wasn't just about pushing tanks around. There were some really interesting things here. So he put this thing together, and I've always been fascinated by this Canadian Civil War game that he put together because, he didn't understand a lot about Canadian politics, but he did create a system that was actually very interesting. But it was also of its time in that it was rather symmetrical. And it was abstract, maybe a little bit too abstract for people to figure out. And of course, it had a lot of charts and a lot of die rolls and that kind of thing, the way everything did back then. And there was this absurd military end game that was kind of tacked on at the end of it. I think the only reason why he tacked on the end of this module, which you get into if somebody decides, oh, well, enough of this, let's have a war, is number one, because people kind of expected it to be there. And number two, they had run down a complete order of battle of the Canadian forces, regular and reserve components. And they figured, well, we got room on the counter sheet, let's fill it up. So this is a reboot of Canadian Civil War via the GMT coin system, or an adaptation of the GMT coin system. So again, it's 4 players. It's asymmetric, but the mechanisms are very, very different. And it has 4 scenarios from 4 different periods in Canadian politics. And it has a deck of event cards, containing a lot of jokes that are really probably comprehensible only to Canadians, but some of them are, of course, more generic as well. Yeah, at least people can be compelled to, go out and look up what is meant by Shawinigan handshake.
Yes, I loved seeing that card. Absolutely.
That is the most violent bit in the game, actually, is the Shawinigan handshake.
True.
It is like all the coin system games so far. They've always been about guerrilla wars or occupations or that kind of thing, and cruel and violent in their way. I mean, China's war, millions dead, atrocities, here and there. But O Canada is completely non-kinetic. I've always felt from the beginning that the coin system would be well adapted to a power politics, non-violent kind of situation. Now, there's been non-violent factions, in other games before in the coin system, but this is a completely non-violent game.
Absolutely, and that's one of the many fascinating parts about it. We'll discuss Okada a little more later, but now let's jump to China's war, which you were just talking about there. I know a lot of people are interested to hear about it.
Oh, it's heavy.
Absolutely.
This is a heavy one, folks.
So with that, it's so different from so many World War II Pacific theater games. A lot of those don't even really feature the Chinese theater, or they do it as a little track or something. And if they do, it's still very much this like Allies versus Japan, rather than showing off all these different Chinese factions and how they interacted. Why did you decide on trying to bring this to a coin series treatment?
Well, I've always been interested in the Sino-Japanese War, the 37 to 41. There were very, very few games, at least in English, on this war. I'm happy to see that there are more and more Chinese designers, both in Taiwan and on the mainland, who are interested and are starting to develop more and more games, and very clever, very sophisticated, subtle designs on modern Chinese history. It's great to see this. But back when I was designing, there was almost nothing that was being done on that. There was a game called The China Incident that came out in the old Wargamer magazine in 1985. Tom Wham, if you remember him, the guy who did the awful green things from outer space. One of his first wargame designs was one called The Long March, which is from 1937 to 1945. It's kind of a very simple war game, but it extends through that period, and it's actually for 3 players. So it's interesting in its way, but it's obscure and, of course, almost unobtainable. But I was always interested in it, and I thought that I would like to do a game about the 1937 to 41 period of the war, and I did. It's an area movement game. It's sort of political military, because there's different indices that people have to track. The nationalist has to placate some warlord factions, and you have the communists, a Chinese Communist Party as a third contender as well. And this is a game that I put together in 1999, and it was published through the Microgame Design Group. And that came out as sort of a DTP effort. And at the same time, I came out with an expansion kit called, very unoriginally, More Battle for China. And that was additional rules and counters for you to take it from 1942 to 1945, and then for the Civil War, 1946 to 1949. And if you wanted to, you could string all 3 together and go from 1937 through to the end of the Civil War whenever that happened, because it did, things could wind up a little bit sooner. So I published that one through the Microgame Design Group, and it was republished a few other times by other designers. Ultimately, it came out in an issue of one of the Decision Games magazines, and that was the end of that. It was actually the first game that I published in Japanese Command magazine. It came out in 2002. They did a beautiful production job with it, in Japanese language, of course. And it was actually the first original game to appear in Japanese Command magazine that hadn't been designed by a Japanese. Up until that point, they had been doing a lot of reprints, like the Series 120 games, by GDW and Frank Chadwick and stuff. But this was the first original game, new game that they put in the magazine. To be published, by a non-Japanese designer, which I thought was nice. Anyway, that was 2010 when the last time 2009 2010 when the game was designed and published by Decision Games when that edition came out, and we kind of left it there. But I was still interested in it, and here we are. It's 2015. 5 years later, and I'm working on Colonial Twilight. A Distant Plane is finished. I'm working on a Colonial Twilight because GMT asked me to put, and there's another whole story there. I don't think we have time for that right now. But I was working away on that. But at the same time, I was struck with an idea. Okay, why don't I take this and put it in the coin system? I think it might be good. And yeah, I think it came together pretty quickly. As I said, I got it to the mostly done phase in 2015, the original concepts. In development, we ended up tweaking a lot of things, but they weren't major tweaks or redesigns. I would say probably the one thing that caused us the most back and forth was how to treat the warlords. There were different methods that we tried at one time or another to show the fractious, nature of the warlords, all these different factions, and how they were sometimes under their own command, and sometimes they bent the knee, to the central army and the nationalist government, but they had their regional interests at the same time. We did a bit of back and forth about that, but for the rest of it, it was tweaking and twiddling, and it takes time to get right, of course. And to come up with a set of interesting, event cards that are worth playing, an acceptable volume on kinds of things as well. So yeah, that's my, that's almost my last work in the GMT coin system. And then, and it's probably the last time, I'll do something on China, but I think, 2 or 3 games, that's enough.
For sure. Yeah, that brings up a good question Robert asked in the chat earlier of when you were developing China's War, did you consider different factions than what the game was published with?
I think Robert is asking, was I considering a different arrangement of players?
Yeah.
Because there's 4 players in the game. There's the Japanese, of course, and 3 Chinese factions that are resisting the Japanese invasion. There's the Communist Party of China, the nationalist government, which is the Central Army, the KMT Central, the Kuomintang Central Army, and Chiang Kai-shek, who's the lead, the leader of the Republic of China. And then there are, well, we call it the warlords, and there are some games, there are a couple of games. There's a game called War of the Suns by Leonard Toe. And of course, the Magnificent Octopus in English language games is War of Resistance by, I can't remember the designer right now, but it was put out by GDW, and or not GDW, Game Research and Design, which it's Europa series, but it's Europa for 1937 to 41. A stupendous game, huge, like a dozen maps and sheet after sheet after sheet of counters, and they treat dozens and dozens of factions and cliques, and they're, with a game like that, they can really get into trying to placate these kinds of things. And my challenge, of course, was how to keep that manageable and abstracted enough to make it a difficult task for the nationalists to try and push them around as needed for the interests of the greater interests of the Republic of China, and yet at the same time for the warlords to protect themselves and advance their own agendas, because again, they have regional interests, they have regional networks to answer to, as well as the central government. So it was pretty clear to me that those 4 were the 4 that I really needed. I guess maybe one controversial, I don't know if it's controversial, nobody's really yelled about it at me about it yet so far, but is the notion of the Japanese having collaborators. This was something that I had from the very beginning in my original game on the Battle for China, the one in 1999. The Japanese can raise collaborationist forces, because during the war, during 1937 and 41, there were several 100,000 Chinese, who were collaborating with the Japanese, again, for a number of reasons. And by 1944 or 45, there were nearly 1 million collaborationist troops under one regional or puppet government or another. And that's setting aside the puppet kingdom of Manchukuo, which is, as you see, a little gray area off to the left on the map there. So I thought that needed to be included at least acknowledged in the design. So you can see on the map that Andrew's put up here, the collaborationists are white cubes. They work as police, like police cubes do in the other GMT coin games. They're generally static. They're rear area security forces. You cannot use them to attack anybody, but they defend areas and lines of communication. The Japanese, by their recruit action in the game, can subvert warlord forces and to a certain extent convert them into collaborationists, which is how it was done. In many cases, the Japanese would set up some kind of a regional government. They do a deal with one or more warlords or factions, and create what they called an autonomous regional government of one kind or another. There were several of these running at any given time. The most famous collaborator, of course, is a man named Wang Jingwei, who was a contender against Jiang Jiechi for leadership of the Kuomintang. But again, that the party was just riven by factions. He defected. He survived at least one assassination attempt, and he was sort of like the chief collaborationist, but he did not survive the war.
Yeah, and he's a very important card in that game for sure.
Yeah,
that's
right. So anyway, that's one thing that's in that game that you don't have quite to the same extent as in others. But I thought it was important to include acknowledgement of it. How much use the Japanese wants to make of collaborationists, it can vary. Historically, they didn't use them that much, but certainly they had considerable numbers of people, Chinese under arms, working for the Japanese. They can do a little bit more of that, than they did historically in the game. But again, it's a choice for the player.
For sure. One last China's war question for you real quick. The game really emphasizes lines of communication, and that's something that's been in a lot of these coin volumes, but often you can see it even ignored in a coin game. So why was it so critical in this one?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you're right. So many people, when they start in on playing a GMT coin system game, once they've learned part of the system, they start by playing it like an area movement game, and they treat the lines of communication just as borders between areas. But at some point, the light goes on, and they start figuring out what the lines of communication are for and how to use them, and then it becomes a different kind of game. In this game, that is baked into it right from the very beginning, and you have to grok that from the very beginning, because if you don't, you're not going to do very well. The reason why this is emphasized to an extent so much greater than in the other GMT coin system games is because of the nature of the Japanese invasion and occupation. I've heard it characterized as a line and dot strategy. The Japanese invaded, and what they did was they took over the railroads and the rivers that supplied the towns and cities that are the juncture points for the lines of communication, and that's what they were interested in occupying. They wanted to control the useful part of the population, useful from their point of view, of course. They wanted to control the material wealth and the resources, the industrial plants, factories, that kind of thing. But if you lived more than a few miles away from a town or a railroad station or anything like that, chances are you wouldn't see very much of the Japanese during the war, because they mostly spent, whatever people they had in occupying Japan. They spent most of their time, maintaining their control of the lines of communication. And that is the major Japanese victory condition. They must seize and control keep control of the great majority of the economic value of the lines of communication. So they also have to keep up. They also have to do that job. They have to make a good job of it. And if they make a good job of it, then they won't have to worry about how much commitment they're getting from Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, which is their commitment score. Those are the two qualities of their victory condition. But they are focused. They have to be laser focused on that. And from time to time, they'll jump off the railroad track or jump out of the river, and they'll go sweep through to put down guerrillas or break up concentrations of the nationalists or that sort of thing. But they have to stay focused on that. And the three Chinese factions, who all have their own agendas, but they're all united in opposing the Japanese invasion, they have to think about that as well. They really have to contest with the Japanese for control of those lines of communication. Because if they spend too much time and effort, fighting each other and cutting each other out, then the Japanese is just going to march to victory over top of them. This is another thing that people have to watch out for the first time or two they play the game. And yeah, just, pay attention. But anyway, that's why that particular point is baked into the design. And I think people have understood that from the beginning fairly quickly.
For sure.
And there's O Canada.
There's O Canada. Yeah, let's try to get that up so we can go talk about it next. It's also on the table behind me, but this is a better image of it in actual play.
I don't know, and you can see my bald spot in this one.
Fair enough. So first thing with O Canada, you mentioned earlier, but why a completely non-violent game in the GMT coin system?
Yep, it's just as I said. I always thought that the GMT coin system would fit itself really well to power politics, because you've got asymmetry of so many things. You've got asymmetry of means, method, and opportunity, and I thought that there wasn't any reason, like people say, like the coin system, well, it's all about insurgencies and guerrilla wars. Well, yeah, we do call it the coin system, which stands for counterinsurgency. And most of the titles do have some kind of insurgency or an insurgent faction in them in the historical situation. But it doesn't have to be quite that way. Again, it's a game system, and it's a very flexible system, and people have taken it in all kinds of different directions. And Stephen Raganzas, of course, has stripped it down, to in his quad games, the British Way and the Guerrilla Generation. And again, these are insurgencies, but still, it's very flexible in that it can be reduced, to there, and then of course it can be opened out into to deal with other situations as well. So this is the first one I think that's a strictly non-military design. I know that there's an awful lot of ingenuity and energy out there being expended by loads of other people on, using the GMT coin system or variations thereon, and that's fine. I mentioned before, this is my last planned essay in the GMT coin system. Volko's moved on from it. I'm moving on from it. I think the system is in good hands. There's a lot of people, who are expending a lot of energy and thoughtfulness, and so it would be my hope to see this system carry on with more and more unlikely situations, moving further and further away from historical warfare, but to other things as well. China's war. This is the first coin system game that's set in World War II. There are other partisan campaigns that could be done. Yugoslavia, for example. I know one of those has been in the works for a long time, but it's probably will be a while yet. We have the science fiction application in Red Dust Rebellion, and then people are working on it on other things. So yeah, I've always been interested in politics, especially the area where politics and the military cross. I've always been interested in power politics, and I love the Canadian Civil War game, for its potential in so many different things. And I thought, let's just do it over again, but do it this way. That I think would appeal to people because it's got the GMT coin system, which is largely diceless. It's an abstract exercise, but maybe not too abstracted. And again, I wrote 4 different scenarios for the game that attempt to show shifts in Canadian politics and the makeup of the country as time goes on. I mean, one of the biggest developments, long-term developments in Canada, is the shift of population from the east to the west. And you can see this happening in the game to an extent, to the point where British Columbia and Alberta, they start to grow in population over time in the later scenarios, and that means power. And it also means a growth of Western separatists. This is something that's in the news right now, actually. Just the other day,
Absolutely.
yeah, just the other day, we had a big news item where some Albertan people who are interested in Alberta separating from Canada met with officials of the United States State Department. They won't say exactly what happened, and the State Department won't say exactly what happened, but I assume it was a friendly meeting. Yeah, so again, it's not just Quebec anymore. When James Dunnigan designed his game originally, it was dealing strictly with the linguistic and cultural alienation that suffered by Quebecois, and that's still the case. We still have a political party in Canada called the Bloc Québécois, who are interested in greater independence, or maybe not outright separation, but greater independence, greater autonomy for Quebec within the Confederation of Provinces that is Canada. And, we have Alberta, and, there's been a lot of, minor key Western separatism going on in the prairies, even in British Columbia a little bit, for quite a while now. It tends to attract a lot more oxygen than it should, in my point of view, but it's this sort of thing that creates instability in political units in countries, and there are ways of working these things out.
Absolutely, yeah. And as a Canadian myself and a student of Canadian history, I think that's I love this game, and I think that's maybe the most fascinating argument in it, is treating the Quebec separatists and other provincial separatists as a singular faction. So it's really interesting to see that.
Well, it's important to note, and this is something that Dunning had with Canadian Civil War, and which I've kept because I think it's one of the best insights, the best ways to manipulate or give the game a mechanism, is that the four players, they don't represent political parties, they don't represent regions even, they represent four tendencies in Canadian politics, and the main tension between them and within them and between them is the tension, the balance of power and division of powers between the federal government and the provincial governments. And, that's wrapped up in the term federalism. And so you have the four factions in Canada. You have you have the Federalists, who believe in a strong central federal government. You have two flavors of provincials. There's provincial moderates, who believe in a division of powers that's somewhat similar to what we have now in Canada, where the provinces have, quite a bit of power, but not ultimate power over many things. Then there's the provincial autonomists, who think that the dial should be turned a little bit over more towards the provincial side, with a smaller and weaker federal government. And then you have the separatists. And again, I'm not talking about outright separation, the sovereign republic of Albersask or something like that. But people who think more like that Canada should become a little bit more like something like the EU, for example, where you have regions where cultural, linguistic, and economic differences are respected. But again, not a breakup of Canada completely. So it's a set of four takes on federalism, and again, trying, in the four different scenarios, I'm trying to show how these forces are disposed, at least at the beginning, of when it's 1950, 1970, 1990, whenever. Just my estimate of where the balance of forces was at the time. But of course, after that, people develop and they fight each other, and how they do it. Another important part of this is how the game in O Canada is played on two different levels. On one level, it's the level of party politics and organizing and voting blocks and that sort of thing. And that's the map part. If you're looking at the image here, you can see that there is a map of Canada with clusters of cubes and discs and things like that. But up north, where you have the Yukon and Northwest Territories, you have a series of boxes, and these are issues. These are non-tangible. It's all about seizing the narrative on certain things, and during the game, the players have to duel with each other for control of these intangible issues. These are political, social, and economic issues, things like tariffs and banking, healthcare, Indigenous affairs, hockey, this kind of thing. Had to have hockey, but again, this is referring to kind of the not immaterial, but the non-material part of politics, because there's power that's exerted by someone who is seen as controlling the narrative on something, and that's a different kind of power from having raw strength on the ground. Of voters that you can count on, money that you can collect, laws that you can write and rewrite. But I think that politics has this non-material dimension to it as well, and that's the other aspect of this game that's developed. Again, it's originally in like fighting over issues is a big part of the original Canadian Civil War, and of course I've kept that basic concept, but of course here it's manipulated in a different way.
Absolutely. Well, and that's a fascinating look at it. Well, Brian, I know you've got to get running pretty soon, so thank you so much for your time here. There's obviously a lot more we could discuss, but I think this is a really great rundown of things. I'm going to turn it over to you. Is there anything else you want to plug from 2025 or anything else you're looking ahead to?
Well, one of the questions that we were thinking about was you wanted to ask me about some things that I'm working on right now, and
Yes.
I do identify them in that end of year post that you kindly linked to. So Houses of Cards and District Commander Briganti are two games that I've done on the Great Brigandage, which is in post-Risorgimento Italian, southern Italy. Those will be coming out from an Italian publisher later this year. The scalable urban simulation is, again, another thing I've been doing on urban warfare. It's intended for professional use, but eventually I'll probably put it out for free print and play by people. There's the quick game. I keep working on that as well. And I mentioned Strongman, now called The Chair is Empty. That is a game that I put up for free print and play just a couple of weeks ago. This is another power politics game. It's a development of something that I first developed like 12 years ago it was a thinly disguised post-Chavez Venezuela, before Chavez was post-Chavez. But I worked it out into, I think, a much better power politics game. It's available for free print and play. I had GMT interested in possibly looking at publishing it, but with the disruption that's been going on, both in the gaming industry over the tariffs and in the political tension right now, I don't know. I decided to simply go ahead and publish it as a free print and play. I would like to self-publish it later in the year with better art. Right now, the version that's available has this cheap, janky, free clip art that I've just stuck together. I would like to release it with original art by essentially volunteer artists for one thing or another to make it look nice. I did find a good printer in Mississauga to put the thing together for me. I will not use artificial intelligence. I will not use generative AI in any aspect of this. I suppose I could have done that and it would look, AI cheesy. I'm very firmly in the, keep humans, keep humans contributing to this kind of side of the house. So if I can find, some original art that people would like to have on the cards, then I would like to self-publish, and see how it goes. And you know what? Anything I self-publish, it can be picked up later. Many of them have been picked up by larger publishers later, and that's great. But in the meantime, I like to make these things myself. I like to put them out myself and let the chips fall, or let the dice roll, or let the counters be eaten. I don't know.
Absolutely. Well, many of us in the hobby are very grateful that you do. Thank you again so much for your time, Brian. I greatly appreciate it. And yeah, thanks for updating us on all of what you have going on. And make sure to check out Brian's website for links to all this.
Thanks. I'll pop over into the Discord room, and if anybody has any questions or discussion there, if you're spare me some time from the next event, I'll answer some questions. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you all. Have a great one.